Hi everyone, good to see you all. So my name is Jeremy and I work in Chile for the Center for Ecosystem Modeling and Monitoring. And my line of research is basically trying to measure and predict conflicts in conservation. I'm an ecologist, conservation ecologist and modeler. I am by no means a social scientist, and I prefer to say that because it means that a lot of the work I'm going to present is basically involved a lot of collaborations with social scientists, and I think it's really key to acknowledge that. So it's good to start with a definition. So what I mean by conservation conflict, broadly speaking, is a clash or disagreement between two or more stakeholders regarding the development or implementation of conservation measures. We can sort of narrow that down in the case of human-wildlife conflict to a clash or disagreement regarding the management of impact-causing wildlife. And I'm also inspired by Steve here, that basically if we consider two parties, one conservationist party and another party that has different interests, if each party tries to win, basically, then there will be a conflict. And in order to solve that conflict, we need to try and find a middle ground, compromise, dialogue, in order to potentially grow towards a win-win situation. So how have we been measuring conservation conflict intensity? So there are a wide variety of different frameworks. I'm just going to highlight two. One is the levels of conflict model, which basically separates conflicts into three sort of levels. The first one is the dispute, which is often the example is often a car crash between two individuals that don't know each other, and you're basically patching up the repairs on the cars. The underlying conflict is a car crash between a recently divorced couple, and there's a history of unresolved conflicts or disputes. And the third one is basically when there are deeper values involved. So it would be, for example, a car crash between a French person and a British person. I can say that I'm both. I have that internal conflict in my mind. The other one is something called the potential for conflict index, which basically looking at consensus around management decisions or conservation decisions. So in this case, you have management. So the y-axis is basically whether there's strong agreement or strong disagreement, and the size of the circle represents whether there's lots of consensus or not much consensus. And in this example, it was looking at management strategies concerning puma in Torres del Paine National Park in southern Chile, and deciding which management strategies to sort of implement. But these are very valuable approaches, but they sort of fall short of considering interactions between stakeholders, like antagonistic and collaborative actions, and they mean that we sometimes struggle to quantify and better predict the emergence of conflicts of conservation and their dynamics. So how can we better do that? So we got together back in 2018. Well, it's been a while, and we got together in Oxford with people from different countries, bringing different case studies to the table, and we basically were trying to inspire ourselves from the study of armed conflicts, where they have lots of data sets, big global data sets. They measure every variable that can possibly influence the emergence of an armed conflict, and see how we could inspire ourselves from that study. And there are lots of complicated models, but we settled for something quite simple, which was the curve of armed conflict, which basically divides escalation and de-escalation into several stages. And we adapted that to conservation conflicts, which are not quite as severe as armed conflicts, but it goes from coexistence or collaboration through to violence, and different levels of disagreement and unilateral and multilateral action. And so how do you gather this evidence? And this is probably the most difficult step, and it's quite flexible, but from various sources. You can go to papers, to books, to online surveys, to newspapers, to whatever you want, WhatsApp groups, and you go through this decision tree to assign levels to different temporal steps of a conflict. And we try to apply this to different case studies: geese in Scotland that eat crops, baboons in South Africa, elephants, the management of national parks, the management of vaquitas. There are very few vaquitas left. And we basically came up with conflict timelines that have these different stages, and we could basically see the different dynamics of the conflict between humans. And then you can do lots of things. You can do lots of modeling to see transition stages, how the conflicts transition between different levels. You can look at stasis. Does a conflict stay at a certain state, or does it sort of switch states? You can also look at, start including covariables and seeing whether the collaboration at one time step, these are very weak slopes, but they are, some of them are significant, whether if there is collaboration at time t minus 1, whether that influences the de-escalation, for example, or you can look at if a conflict lasts for a long time, whether that's going to influence the probability of de-escalation or escalation. So what's the potential of this approach? You have spatial temporal flexibility. You can have different time intervals for conflict. You can apply it at a very local level or at a national level, even global level. It's a method to track conflict development. It's also a method to evaluate conflict management, and I'm going to show a case study that has the potential to do that. And it also means it's a driver to build a conflict database and to basically predict where they might occur globally, both at a global level, regional, or national. We're currently sort of very slowly starting to build this database, but open to collaborations, obviously. So I'm going to show two case studies of how this has kind of been incorporated, the first one more than the second one. But first, I want to go to the Amboseli-Tsavo landscape, where lion guardians have been, for a long time, implementing a project that basically uses the knowledge of local warriors to protect lions. And I have a PhD student, which I co-supervise with Vincent Nord from the University of Cape Town and Stephanie Dolrenry. And Nadia has been painstakingly going through 10 years of stakeholder discourse and actions. And this involves going through WhatsApp group messages, it involves going through newspapers, reports, everything that people have said or done in the study area. And this means that she has been able to sort of come up with this dynamic landscape of where conflicts, or how the conflict is changing spatial temporally. And the great thing here is that you also have conservation interventions that happen on the landscape, and you can start evaluating how these have influenced the conflict transition probabilities, which means that we can see whether if lion guardians have strengthened the bone in a certain area, how that impacted the next month, the conflict level, because this is on a monthly sort of time frame. So I work in Chile, so I thought I'd include a case study from Chile, and it's a very long country. And I work on carnivores in Chile in different areas, and sort of the framework that I try and implement in these different areas is one called socio-ecological suitability. So the basic idea is that you map human acceptance with habitat suitability. And then that can help you guide conservation interventions. So if you have areas that are ecologically and socially unsuitable, you know that you have to invest time in basically working with people and working with the ecology, the habitat, whatever it is. You can also have areas that are ecologically but not socially suitable, and then you have to work with people more, and etc., etc. And this is it's a simple framework that is relatively easy to quantify with the data that we have. And I wanted to see, so I work in the Araucanía region of Chile, which is a beautiful, amazing place full of monkey puzzle trees, forests of monkey puzzle trees, perfectly conical volcanoes, and it has lots of carnivores. It has pumas and lots of smaller things like la huiña, and this is called El Quique at the bottom, which is the Chilean honey badger. It's just as ferocious as its African counterpart. But there's also a landscape of lots of livestock, and they have beautiful system where they go from wintering grounds to summer grounds higher up in the Andes, in the mountain range, and it's just a really nice system to work in because it's very dynamic. But there's also a lot of conflict, it has to be said. There's a lot of sort of puma killing, huiña killing, and it's putting in danger a lot of the populations. So this is very preliminary results. I literally got the results this week, and I was frantically modeling to try and see what it would look like. And actually, the patterns are quite interesting. So bear with me. This is a terrible figure, but we monitored habitat suitability with camera traps of different carnivores, so using occupancy models, etc., to try and figure out where they were distributed according to natural variables in the landscape, where they would distribute themselves. And we also did lots of surveys and games as well with local owners, and we work on a owner by owner. So we go from door to door. They all have different lands. They some have 10 hectares, others have 300 hectares, and they have a different number of camera traps depending on the amount of hectares. And we interview them. So we know we've worked with 63 so far, and we know exactly what they think or perceive or do, and we can relate that to the presence of carnivores on their land. And so this figure. Basically, if you fit the dot on the x-axis, you have human acceptance, which is we have more data, but this is a 7-based Likert scale, 7-point Likert scale, and on the y-axis you have predicted occupancy in black, and the dots are basically the same as the framework I was showing you, and you can see that up here there's a big gap. That's where there's high human acceptance and high sort of occurrence or suitability of the habitat, and there's a big gap there. Most of the points are sort of in the low acceptance or low habitat suitability. So it's a bit depressing, but there's work to be done. There's a few sorts of landowners that do have both. And the yellow is basically a simple question, which is the only one it was time to analyze. It's basically the proportion expressing disagreement with another stakeholder, mainly the one managing wildlife. And here you can see that there's a clear divide between people who have low acceptance of carnivores, usually, and it's related to distrust, basically, or disagreement, and the ones that have high acceptance basically don't show that trend. And we've also incorporated the conflict levels that I was mentioning before, but I didn't have time to have a look at those. So hopefully the next Congress will have a look at that. And that's it really, just to thank all the people in the Interdisciplinary Conservation Network, Lion Guardians, and in the Lonkimai project. And please do get in touch if you're interested in collaborating. And just to point out that this illustration was commissioned for the armed conflict work, and I highly recommend working with pen and paper. This is basically in a crowded world, we have lots of conflict, and what do we need to do? We need to collaborate to get out of this box, basically. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much. Okay, right. Okay, thank you very much, Jeremy. It's an excellent work. I work just next door. I work in Bolivia, and I work with carnivores. I mean, a lot of similarities. My question is, we're working towards changing people's attitudes, increasing tolerance, and all those things. But now we're looking. Now we're facing another two threats. One is climate change and the political situation of new governments and all those variables. Are you planning to use those variables as well, especially the political one? Thank you.
That's a really good question, thank you. So the climate change one we are going to use because there's a big drought in the area, and that's influencing livestock patterns, so it's influencing how people use the landscape, and it also influences interactions with carnivores. The political one is an interesting one. I think that it would be interesting, at a regional level, we definitely are using it, because there's a lot of distrust, there's a lot of negative interactions with authorities, shall we say. At a national level, Chile is undergoing a lot of ups and downs, and it is sort of influencing people, probably perceptions and attitudes and behaviours, I'm sure. But we haven't reached that level of detail yet. But it's a great question, thank you.
Here in the back, make a run to the very back. Let's do this one first. I wonder if you can see changes in the conflict in the space and time after some incident happened, like massive killing of livestock due to droughts, for instance, and the opposite. If after some action has been taken, like in conservation, there has been an improvement in the tolerance or the acceptance.
Another great question. So I'm going to use the Ambaselli sort of example, and I don't want to spoil Nadia's results, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but we have tested sort of how the escalation and de-escalation after various sort of measures implemented by Lion Guardians, but also after sort of with climate, related to climate, and the resolution of the data is very fine, and you can see these changes. But I'm not going to lie, getting to that resolution is like it's quite, that's the key problem here. It's the key challenge is getting that detail, that resolution. But yes, you can see changes at quite a fine scale.
Thank you.
Jeremy,
Hi, Mauro.
the work you are doing in Chile is very interesting, but it is very labor intensive. So are you thinking about some kind of indicator, some kind of way of making it simpler and having the same reliable results as an indicator of conflict?
Like AI and social media, for example, combined.
It's a good question. I'd love to. I'd love to know. I mean, to be honest, after working with like global data sets and things like that, I was really happy to just spend time on a local scale and get, really talk to everyone. But I agree that it's not cost effective in the long term. And I think that one option could be to sort of see how we could extrapolate not only ecological data, but social data to see whether attitudes, behaviors, perceptions, whatever it is, can be sort of modeled according to some variables and try and extrapolate it at the landscape level. I'll have to think about that. I'm happy to chat to you about it if you have any ideas.
Thank you so much.